never do, because that has happened. Good evening, folks. My name is Damien Willey, better known as Cornish Damo, and welcome once more to Damo Meets. Tonight, I'm talking to Alex Mays, the founder of the Breakthrough Party. Formed in January of this year, is, according to their website, a new democratic socialist party led by younger voters and activists. So let's dig down into this new organisation and see what they're about. Welcome, Alex. Great to meet you on quite short notice at that. So I very much appreciate your time today. How are you?
No, thanks very much, Damo. No, thanks very much, Damo. Thanks for having me on. Yeah, no, very well, thank you. Very well, very busy with everything going on, but very excited to, you know, like these last 4 months have been a bit crazy, but things are moving really nicely. So yeah, no complaints from my end.
Well, it's, you know, it's one thing to be keeping yourself busy and being politically active, but to set a new party up from scratch, I can only dream of the amount of work you've had to put into that. But let me come to a point that I made in my intro there, firstly, that you're a new party, the Breakthrough Party. It's led by a younger generation of politically active people, your younger members. Now, I know you've only recently opened up membership, only something like 2 weeks ago now. But is this because your party is dominated by younger people, and is your emphasis on younger generations born out of the appeal a Corbyn-led Labour had that spoke directly to young people at times, and that Labour has since sort of turned its back on? Are you continuity Corbyn for young people?
Like, this definitely hasn't happened by accident. Like, yeah, we have like a lot of young members, but we also have like quite a good mix of age groups and demographics within the organisation already. Like anyone from like people in their sort of 60s and 70s who are in the Labour Party for decades, you know, being like, you know, very big activists within their space, like, or like former like CLP secretaries, chair people, whatever else. But we've also got, like, as you said, like, you know, lots of young people that maybe haven't even been involved in frontline politics before, or even some that have been very apathetic to politics. People, because old society that we've created, at the moment, one of low wages, insecure work, sky high rents and unaffordable housing as well. And as I think Starmer's Labour have sort of completely abandoned young people in his chase for like these, you know, mythical red wall voters. And these issues aren't being addressed now, which is a real fundamental issue. And that's sort of where we come in. And I think as well has been commentated on a lot before, but that age is now the new dividing line in British politics. The traditional class system, that's what it used to be, but now it has definitely moved towards age. We saw that in 2017 and 2019. And why is that? Like, ultimately, like, young people, when in terms of the status quo and things staying the same, that does not benefit young people. You know, the points I mentioned before about work, about housing. If we keep going down this path, these are, you know, this is a future that isn't very good for young people. While older voters traditionally will vote more conservative, well, especially in the last couple of elections, because things stay the same and they're in a good, you know, ultimately a much better position. So yeah, like, I think we're here to, I guess, like, plug the sort of vacuum that has been left by the Labour Party, you know, and that there is plenty of space on the left, I think, for a party like ours to exist.
Well, as a Labour member, I have to be a little careful how I phrase things. But certainly the way Starmer has been running the party and has appeared to be attacking the left of his own party more so than the Conservatives, it does seem that there's a niche, a gap in the market, so to speak. And obviously, we've seen various socialist parties pop up, such as the Northern Independence Party and yourself now as well. You know, just as Labour describes itself accurately or not, you're a democratic socialist party. I know you're going through all the processes of establishing your democratic structures, which is completely understandable, given you've only been around since January and you want to be member-led. 2 weeks into open membership, you clearly need time. But I want to ask you what socialism means to you, rather than the democracy side of things. The mainstream media have made a brilliant job of tarring that word so much, even some in Labour won't use it. We're rather proud of it. We're socialist telly. But what does the word mean to you, and how do we make it a term to be proud of once again, in light of how much it's been damaged?
Yeah, this is like a real issue. Like, as you touched on, I think socialism and like the word socialist has sort of been dragged through the mud by the political and the media establishment. And it's tough. It's about reclaiming that word. To me, what does socialism mean? I'll be honest with you, like, until like 5-6 years ago, when I started getting engaged with politics, I didn't even know what a socialist was. I wasn't brought up in a particularly political household. And, you know, but then I started getting more invested in politics, and I sort of realized that I've always sort of held socialist values. To me, it's beyond the sort of traditional definition of like workers controlling some of the means of production. It's more, for me, it's about fighting for those who are oppressed by the system that we find ourselves in. And for me, it's about fighting for fairness, justice, and equality. Ultimately, it's about caring for your fellow citizens. You know, I don't know how we're going to reclaim this word. I think what we have to look at is how can we educate the population about socialism, what it actually is, and be able to communicate that in an accessible way. I think that's been the trouble over these years, is like, I don't think people have quite realized what socialism is. And that's, you know, that, I guess that vacuum, that, you know, that narrative has been spun by the media because no one's actually been able to really explain to people what it actually is. And now, as you say, like, we've now got this sort of twisted narrative of what socialism is, and it leads to communism, Marxism, all the other, you know, all the other sort of terms that are thrown around. So yeah, I think there's a lot of work to do, and I think, you know, it'll be the job of like parties like Breakthrough and like Tusk and Northern Independence Party to sort of reclaim that word and show people what it actually is in practice.
Yeah, re-educating people. I know when we were campaigning to try and get Corbyn elected and all the rest of that business, we used to refer to it as the cult of giving a shit, which is essentially what it is.
Bang on.
I mean, you just, it's all it is wanting a fair crack for everybody concerned. People can't afford to own a home. They can't, there isn't even enough social housing to house everybody. There's overcrowding and massive homelessness. And these are things that can be easily corrected. Because I always, whenever I think of homelessness, I've just raised that example, so I'll carry on with it. I always think of it in terms of, you know, when the COVID crisis first broke out, for example, and they were worried about all the people on the streets, that they could be a source of transmission. How quickly did they get them off the streets? And where are they back now? I mean, they could have fixed this problem. It's a political choice to be cruel, to not give a damn. And socialism, to me, is correcting that. And I really don't see why people can argue against it. But of course, the media spin it with all these terms like Marxist and Trotskyist and Stalinist and all the rest of that.
You're absolutely right there, because I think, you know, when we talk about the magic money tree, and like that's been, you know, pushed around a lot in terms of that term, but like, we've seen during this pandemic, the money exists. Like we saw it with the furlough scheme. How many billions did that cost? You know, the amount that was put towards a failed test and trace system. Like, the money is there. As you said, it's a political choice. And we need to make people aware of that, because, you know, I think we've seen a lot more about modern monetary theory recently. And there's been a bit more talk about how, you know, how government debt works. Yeah. And I think that needs to be a massive thing that's, you know, people need to be educated on. Is like, you know, it isn't like a household debt. Like, government debt is not like household debt, and we need to, you know, and as I said, we've seen now during the pandemic, the government has the money, so they have no excuse now. Every decision they make, as you say, is a political choice, and we need to correct that.
That's it. I mean, yeah, you're right. It doesn't work like a household budget. We can't print our own money because we get locked up for counterfeiting. But the government can do exactly that because it owns the means of production of our own currency. And if they invest that and get a return on it, then the economy grows. Exactly. We can only live within finite budgets. But yeah, it's too often it is portrayed as, oh, we can't afford it. Labour will bankrupt the country. We've heard so often when Corbyn was the leader, and you simply cannot bankrupt a country that prints its own money. It's such a simple statement of fact, and yet somehow the myth continues to perpetuate. So yes, I think there is a huge call for some economic education. You're one of a number of democratic socialist parties that have appeared recently, shall we say. You've mentioned a few that have actually been around for a while, like Tusk, for example. But you know, the most notable one at the moment is the Northern Independence Party, mainly due to the Hartlepool by-election that is going on. With so many of these democratic socialist parties popping up, are there now too many? Are you at risk of splitting that left vote so much going forwards that we would be enabling the Tories at every election? This is an argument that people are going to make time and time again. You know, you should be backing Labour, a lot of people will say. You shouldn't be splitting that vote. And of course, we've already seen it in Hartlepool, so we know it's going to happen. How would you answer that?
Yeah, so I'll answer, like, there's two questions there, I guess. So like, I'll answer the first one first, which was about the idea of how many democratic socialist parties have popped up. Like, we saw after the 2019 election, like how hurt everyone was. I think there's millions of people who are absolutely devastated about the loss. So I think it was only natural, especially once Starmer came in. Like, you know, I myself was a Labour member until last summer. I think it was natural that once we started seeing Labour move further to the right, and, you know, we started seeing pledge by pledge being broken by Starmer and this sort of assault on the left within the party, that people would leave Labour and want to start something new. You know, as I said before, I think maybe there's the first question was like, there's a political vacuum that needs to be filled. So I think it's only natural there's going to be like a few parties that would pop up here and there. At this stage, I wouldn't say there are too many. You know, I think we're all finding our feet still. Like, as I said before, I think you said before, we've only been going for 4 months.
Yeah.
And I think we need to still figure out among the parties that exist, like what works, what doesn't. And like, it's all part of a rebuilding process, I think, on the left. And in regards to the split argument, if the likes of Breakthrough, Northern Independence Party stand in elections against Labour, we split in the left vote. There is no left vote. Like, Labour aren't the party of the left anymore. Like, from everything that they've done in this last 12 months, it's shown that it's no longer the party of the left. It just isn't. So, like, you know, Northern Independence Party going up in Hartlepool, they are the only party on the left that are competing in Hartlepool, in my opinion. And I think a lot of other people feel the same about that. So, you know, I understand, like, I do understand, and I am sympathetic to people that are still within the Labour Party and trying to fight the good fight. But like, yeah, I just don't think that argument stands up in practice. When we talk about these groups as well, like, you know, likes, as I said before, and you know, NIP and Tusk and whoever else, there's been a long history of the left not being able to work together. And it's become very fragmented. But from what I've already seen so far, there's definitely a desire on all fronts for like new democratic socialist parties to work together. Like, we've already been having initial conversations, as it were, about how we can work together collaboratively. And, you know, we're quite keen on that.
So there's a degree of overlap with well, obviously you've still got to lay out with policy directions, or flesh them, actually, say points. We'll come on to them in a bit. You're in this situation where you can see overlap with other parties of where you want to be, where you want to go, where there's common ground, and where perhaps there's disagreement, there's room for compromise. So I take it you're open to alliances of some sort going forward, elections in some areas, for example, perhaps not standing in northern seats where the Northern Independence Party might talk. I know you've been having conversations with Philip Proudfoot, so is that the sort of thing that you're looking at and you're thinking about going forwards, a more progressive anti-Tory kind of lineup?
Yeah, definitely. I think that's something we've got to look at. I think what we need to be careful of is like who is classed as because I think there's been a lot said about a progressive alliance before between Labour, Lib Dems, Greens. And we need to be very clear about like, what does a progressive alliance actually look like? Like, what parties are actually looking at tackling this sort of failed status quo. You know, I think the mainstream parties aren't doing anything about that. So I think we need to be careful, like, where the alliances are. But like, yeah, like, these conversations are happening. And, you know, I think there needs to be an alliance struck on the left to make sure that we're not going up against each other in certain seats. And, you know, having that relationship and that sort of collectiveness as well, which I don't think has really existed, especially on the left for quite a number of decades, really. So I think like it's exciting time because I think there's a lot of new parties coming out who are willing to work together, and it's really positive, collaborative effort.
Sounds really positive and really forward thinking. Coming back to Labour, one of the main criticisms levelled at Labour, the main Democratic Socialist Party, allegedly the party of the workers, is that too many of the Labour MPs there aren't actually working class, have never really held a proper job in their lives, for instance. I've spoken to a number of them on this show, interviewed a few of them, and you could count the number of MPs that have had that kind of a background on one hand. They do tend to be the ones that come from the left of the party still. I mean, you talked previously about Labour not really being a left-wing party any longer, but I think it's a bit of a grey area, actually, because there are good socialist left-wing Labour MPs there. Who, you know, would you be open to dialogue with Labour still, or not standing in certain seats to help certain Labour candidates. I mean, I'm talking despite the Labour leadership, of course, because clearly they are not of the left any longer. But it's this kind of lack of a working class representation. Is this something you're conscious of? And of your own background, is it an important aspect of founding your party on?
Yeah, absolutely. Like, I think I read something the other day, because I think back in like the 60s and 70s, it was more like 60-70% of Labour MPs were from a working class background. And now I think it's like now 8% of Labour MPs would be considered working class. So as you say, it's a minority for sure. And there is, as you said, there are some really good socialist MPs within Labour. Like, there's no doubt about that. Mm-hmm. Like, I myself come from a working class family. I know that working class people aren't represented well in Westminster. But I don't think there's only a traditional class issue as well. I think when you think of a politician, you think normally how you think of them is they're probably rich, they're probably white, and they're probably an old man. That's normally like the demographic. And I think we need to do a hell of a lot more in terms of making politics more representative of wider society. And that's something, something I'm fighting for, something that the Breakthrough Party is fighting for. And I think that needs to be, across all sort of new parties that are trying to challenge the status quo, we need to really push for that, for sure.
I mean, you're obviously, as a fledgling startup sort of organization as you are at the moment, you have a great opportunity to embrace these ideas from the get-go. You talk about pale, male, and stale. Should we refer them to, as they often have been, MPs, typically middle-aged, older, white men. Proportional representation of BAME, LGBT, disability. Are these consciously in your mind, in your plans, to make sure that you've got ample representation across the board from the get-go? And obviously you're not in a position yet to put candidates up for this, that, or the other yet, but obviously you will in time. Are you consciously aware of ensuring that you have got that balance, that scope, that appeal across all demographics when you start to put your candidates forward?
Absolutely, that has to be in the forefront of our mind. Like, we need to make sure that as a party that we're inclusive, and we have like a diverse range of people from a number of different backgrounds involved in what we're doing. As I said before, it needs to be representative of wider society. Like, we see it in politics to a lot of people, to a lot of communities, and we need to make it so. And I think we have an opportunity as a new party to really shape that, I think. And we need to stand up for people, like, as I said, from like disabled people, from the LGBTQ plus community, from like Black and ethnic minority communities. Like, we need to look at how can we do that. And it's at the forefront of our minds, and we need to make sure that as a party, we really push that.
Let's talk about some of those policy areas I touched on before. You've been particularly critical of Labour for its lack of vision under Starmer. Let's face it, we as Labour members have been particularly critical of Starmer for his lack of vision and policies. Your website describes him as spineless. Lord knows we here on Socialist Telly have been vocal in our own criticisms of Keith as well. You've got 4 main policy areas at this point in time: transforming the world of work, ending the housing crisis, resisting the police state, and fighting for climate justice. Could you elaborate on those areas at all, please? And would you like to see Labour adopt any of them and push for them? Or are you at the point where, as many are, that you wouldn't believe Labour even if they said they would?
Yeah, of course. Like, we've been going for 4 months now. Like, we're very much still working behind the scenes to build out a wider manifesto. But, these are the 4 key areas for us that we really need to look at. Like, when we talk about young people and like what issues affect them, like work, housing, the right to protest, climate justice. These are all really important issues. So, as you said, like, I'll elaborate on like a few of them. So, as you said, like, transform the world of work. When we look at the current state of play with work, it's not good. Like, you look at wages, they're simply way too low. So, like, we need to be ambitious and look at a much higher national living wage. But also what we need to look at is, and I don't think it's talked about enough, is the age bands. When you look at like how low a wage someone's getting if they're under 18, for example, compared to someone who's doing the same job but is a few years older. It makes no sense. So like we need to look at that. You need to look at the gig economy, and you need to look at 0-hour contracts as well. Like we've seen a lot said about, you know, we saw I think it was Uber's victory, and we need to look at like how can we make things better for, you know, I think we're looking at gig economy work especially and thinking how can we probably want to look to end it, to be honest. It's something that we're not a fan of, and we just need to look at enhancing workers' rights as well. You know, I think workers' rights have been stripped away bit by bit over these last few decades, and we need to look at how can we enhance them, and also redefine what work actually is. A lot of people that have had children or are caring for their elderly parents, like they're having to give up their jobs to do this, right? So we need to look at how can we compensate people who are having to do these things. So like these are all things we're looking at. In terms of the housing crisis, it's something that's talked about a lot now. Like, you know, like lots of younger people are struggling to get on the housing ladder. They're caught in this really exploitative renter system for much longer, or having to live with their parents into their 30s. And they're just trapped in this never-ending cycle. So, and not only that as well, there's like, I think you touched on it before, there's a real lack of social housing. I think there's over 1.1 million families that are on the waiting list for social housing. So what we need to do, and we need to be bold, and we need to look to go on a massive social housing build in terms of that. Like, you know, going back to the 1950s, there was a massive one post-war. We need to look at that similar levels now. Like we really do. We need to look at how can we really build on that. We also need to protect renters and improve their rights so they can actually stand up to their landlords, and do a hell of a lot more work there, and just make housing affordable for people. You know, like what it was like back in the 60s and 70s. I think it was something along the lines like your wage was maybe 4 times higher was the price of housing, and now it's more like 8 times higher. So like it's a hell of a lot more difficult to save for a deposit to get the house. So we need to look at a number of different things when it comes to housing, and it's not it's something we need to look at. It's a very complex issue. But then, you know, you said before about homelessness. We saw how quickly we could deal with the homelessness issue as well. Like they were all taken off the streets during the pandemic. You know, like there is a way to do it. We need to look at how can we homeless, and there's about 280,000 I think in this country. It's just so unacceptable in like the 6th richest country in the world. So that's something about housing. About the police state, like it's very topical at the moment, as you've seen with the Kill the Bill protests, but it's about standing up for all oppressed communities who've sort of faced this disproportionate police brutality. We're obviously as a group, we stand in solidarity with Sisters Uncut and, you know, the Kill the Bill protests that are happening this weekend. We've got a few members who are sort of out in London, Manchester and Brighton over the weekend. But like what we need to sort of show as a party is that we're committed to this struggle for change, but not just in Westminster, but like in our communities, in our workplaces, and also on the streets. And finally, sorry, I realise I'm going on a bit here, but like,
you carry on.
You know, I'm on a roll.
I'm not one of those interviewers that constantly chips in. You carry on.
Yeah, no, I'm on a roll. Sorry. But fighting for climate justice as well. Like that's the final one. And like, you know, this is again a massive area that mainstream parties aren't really being radical enough in. Like, you know, the Tories set this target of 2050, and for me, that's just way too late to avoid the sort of impending climate change catastrophe that's on our hands. So we need to look at how can we dismantle the fossil fuel industry very quickly and decarbonize the world economy. What we need to look at, I think, really is a no growth economy, which scares a hell of a lot of people, where it's like, okay, so, you know, you're getting rid of GDP, you're sort of, you know, we need to just stop. And it's scary. Like, we need to be honest with people, right? Like, consumerism, capitalism, it's destroying our planet. And, you know, not only do we need to look at how do we change the behavior of corporations and of the super wealthy, who are the ones who are very primarily responsible for this, but also our own behavior. Like, we need to look at, it's a very difficult ask, but we need to change our way of life completely. And we need to be honest about that. But also what we need to do is look at how do we redistribute wealth and power. to the global south that have been, affected by imperialism, colonialism, and underdevelopment, and are now at the most risk of climate change. These will need to be radical changes, but we're really committed to delivering them. And then, sorry, I realise I've gone on quite a bit here, but like when you talk about Labour as well, like will they adopt these policies? No, they won't. Like that's just that they won't. They're absolutely terrified of doing anything more than tinkering slightly with this failed status quo. We've been around for 4 months, as I said before, and we have more policy ideas than what they've produced in the last year. We've seen recently the jobs, sleaze. It just isn't inspiring, is it? Like, it's not making me go, oh my God, I really want to vote Labour. Like, it really isn't. And I think there'll be millions of people out there that are seeing right through this. Like, Keir having like a pint in his hand and, got the British flag up somewhere. Like, it's just this plastic patriotism is just nonsense, sorry, I know you're a Labour member, so like, I appreciate, like, I'm just absolutely going in here.
I'm
but
a
like,
very critical Labour member. People know if they watch me.
I know, but like, I do feel a sense of like, it's sad to say it, but like, it's just the way they're going is just, it's woeful. And like, when you look at the lack of policies that they have so far, like, what do they stand for? Like, who's actually behind their strategy? Because at the moment, like, I just would not be able to tell you what they are about. And that's the thing for me. Like, next week's gonna be very interesting with the local elections, with the Hartlepool by-election. We'll see what messages cut through, if any. And yeah, it's just, I don't think they will adopt anything like this. I don't think they're willing to be radical or transformative.
It is going to be interesting. I am a little bit worried with seeing Keir Starmer with all these pints in his hand. I am getting a little concerned for his health. It's between that and the pointing. I mean, I don't know. But I'll just come back on some of the points that you've made in all seriousness. I mean, the jobs side of the issue. I completely agree with where you're coming from with the gig economy. The social, it's basically an indictment of how the social contract has been broken down. You don't have this, if you work a hard day's work, you expect a fair day's pay in return, and you don't get that anymore. It's been completely wrecked. What hasn't helped, of course, is the erosion of the powers of trade unions over successive years as well, and their powers have been weakened. And obviously, as a Labour person, trade unionism is incredibly important to me. I'm a member of the trade union. Have you guys been in communication with the trade unions yourselves at all?
Yeah, we have. Yeah, like, we've started having those conversations, like trade unions and like other sort of like pressure groups and other movements. Like, we're really keen to work collaboratively. And yeah, like, as you say, trade unionism is really important. Like, we need to look at how can we increase that power back in the workplace again. I think that's really important. Massively important, and we need to stand on the right side of this. Like, we need to stand on the side of the workers, not employers that are making, who, especially like larger corporations, are very exploitative of their workers. We need to stand up for workers, and we're unequivocally going to stand on that side. Well, I think, not to dig at Labour, but like, I've not seen that same energy from them in the last 12 months, especially.
No. On the matter of housing, yeah, it is virtually impossible to get on the housing ladder these days without an inheritance. What do you propose you're going to do about the lack of housing, or how are you going to bring house prices down to make them affordable? What sort of ideas have you got floating around? Have you fleshed that out at all?
Yeah, of course. Like, that process is still ongoing, but like, I think there has to be, this housing bubble is going to burst. Like, there's absolutely no doubt that's going to happen. Like, we've seen with Rishi Sunak with the latest budget he did back about a month or so ago, that the way that he's sort of doing things is they're inflating it, and this bubble is getting massive, massive now, and it's going to burst. It is going to burst, and we need to look at, like, this is the issue, right? Is that they're going to keep inflating it, and then it will burst, and then they'll inflate it again for another decade or so, and it will burst again. Like, we're sort of caught in this constant cycle that isn't actually working. It's not a sign of a successful economy when we're having to do this. It's almost like window dressing, I would say, like the house prices going up the way they are. And I think, like, what we need to look at, I think we need to look at how can we build more affordable homes and like actually have more access to that, because at the moment we don't. Like, you see so many, like, I live in Manchester, you see so many tower blocks going up, And these are flats that are just completely out of people's reach in terms of price. And what we need to do is bring in quotas for, for builders in terms of like how much affordable housing they need to build. Because yeah, of course, there's going to be people out there that can afford this, but how many? Like, they're in the minority at the end of the day. So we need to look at like, how can we bring in quotas for building companies to actually like make sure that they are building actual affordable homes for people. It's the same issue across the UK in a lot of different, in cities. And I know London's talked about a lot, but like it's a massive issue across the country. So it needs a total shift away from that.
I mean, we've got a bit of a weird problem down here in Cornwall in that all of our properties get bought up by people who come down from up the line who've had a lot more money, and it pushes the house prices up even more. There's even more of a dearth of difference between wages and house prices down here. What they've done down here in places is where they're building new housing, they're ensuring that only local people can buy them, and they're sold at a local price level rather than sort of an open market level. Perhaps that's something you would consider in order to perhaps get on top of the second home ownership issue, which is only going to get worse if the housing market continues to go up, because it's going to be a smaller and smaller number of people that can buy all the properties. And of course, they're going to keep doing it because they see them as investments. I mean, when did housing become an investment and not just somewhere to live? I don't see why housing should be an investment at all. It offends my sensibility somewhat. I don't know if that's how you feel about that, whether I'm a bit radical there. But
no, not at all. No, not at all. You're not being, like, I think it's totally fair to say that. Like, I don't know when this changed. Like, when did a house become a financial asset rather than a home? It's pretty shocking, really. Like, we shouldn't be looking at homes in that way. Like, there's so many people that are just out there who haven't got somewhere permanent to call home, and we need to bring that back. We need to look at this, because it is a massive issue. Like, there's so many people that own hundreds of homes and like letting them out and getting people to pay off their mortgage. It's just not acceptable for me. Like, I just don't understand how we've become that society. Like, obviously it's been something that's been ongoing since the 80s, since all the council houses were starting to be sold off during the Thatcher era. But we need to totally change that system. Like, it's a complete overhaul. And again, people will be scared to hear that, like, especially like homeowners who are in that position, or people that who own several homes. But we can't allow the majority of people to be going through this. Like, we really can't. We need to build a society where everyone has the potential to buy their own home and own their own home, and not just trying to make profit off it.
Yeah, the last thing we want is people ending up getting a state where we're only able to afford like half a home or something like that, and half rent, and so the sort of thing that they call affordable housing these days. And that's an offensive term as well, because there's nothing affordable about it. But there will be those. Typically, I always think of these people who've always voted the same way for years and years, and essentially people who are happy with the way things are, who will say a party led by the young with the ideas that you've got are chasing unrealistic goals, that you don't know what you're talking about. And this was something Corbyn was accused of with the policies he announced in 2017 and 2019, despite evidently they were quite popular. Now, being young person led is one thing, but to become electable, surely you need to have that wider appeal demographically. Now, I know you've spoken that you do have older members as well, and former members of the Labour Party as well. But how do you overcome and appeal to people who've always voted the same way and convince them that you can deliver real change, especially when we have a system so hardwired towards a two-party state?
It's a tough ask. Of course it is. Like, no denial there. Like, it is going to be very tough. I think when it comes to, a lot of people do say like it's unrealistic, these sort of promises. But as I said before, like, during the pandemic, it's actually shown that this stuff is possible. Like, who would have thought that we could have spent the amount of money we have on the furlough scheme? Like, this money exists and these things can happen. There's just been this like manipulation from the establishment over the last few decades that anything away from this status quo is just totally unrealistic and totally unachievable, when it actually is. I think in terms of like, how do we convince, and like, again, not to make it an age thing, but ultimately it is like, older people are more likely to vote Tory. That just is the way it is. And they're happy with the status quo. They own a home, they have a couple of cars, they're in good, high-paid, high-skilled work. But what is it that will make them vote for us, right? And I think what we need to do is make them realise that the future for their grandchildren, their children, is going to be a very difficult one if we don't advocate for real change. That's what we ultimately need to look at, because at the moment, future generations are coming into a society, into a world that is damaged. It's not in a good way, and we need to really look at how can we, how can we make older generations who are in a much more comfortable position realize that, we need to build a better world, and we need them to be on board with that. It's scary. Like a lot of the things that, when we look at a lot of the policies and areas we're looking at, it can seem quite radical and quite scary, but actually it's very common. It's actually a lot of common sense in it. I think if our children and grandchildren aren't in good positions, that will have a knock-on effect on older generations as well. So I think that's how we need to play it. This is how we need to look at it.
Sure. I mean, it often comes back to a government that often says, "Oh, we can't afford this, we can't afford that." I mean, one of the big topical stories at the moment is the 15% pay rise for NHS nurses, and "Oh, we can't afford that; it's an awful lot of money." But look at what they spent on test and trace, on Serco test and trace. That would pay that 15% NHS pay rise for the next 25 years. They found that. It's amazing how they always find money to waste on things that don't work, and yet when a valid investment in nursing staff who will then spend in the local economy and help the local economies to grow and create more jobs and all the rest of it, it never happens. It always seems to be about lining people's pockets. And I do think the Tories are setting themselves up for a God Almighty fall one of these days, because all they do is seem to put out policies that appeal to those older voters that they have, but they're creating an entire generation of voters, your generation, younger perhaps, who will never ever vote Tory as long as they draw breath.
You've hit the nail on the head. Like, you really have. Like, I think it's a very short-term way of thinking. I think that's what really baffles me about Labour as well, though. Like, why they're moving away from younger voters, minority communities, the most vulnerable in our society. Like, they won't forgive the Tories. And like, we expect this from the Tories, right? Like, we expect them to be this way, and I think, regardless of what happens, I think they could always be this way. But then to see it from Labour as well is obviously very disappointing. I think when we talk about the two-party system as well, like, I generally do believe, and like, maybe I might be in a minority here, but in the next 20 years, if they don't change their ways, I think they both could be gone. Like, they genuinely could be, if they don't evolve and adapt. Like, as you say, they're turning off like a whole generation of people who will never ever vote for them, ever, because of just what they've done, how they've abandoned young people. So like, I don't know if they're going to take note of that. Like, we've seen throughout history where parties of the establishment have sort of shifted just ever so slightly to make sure they can keep appealing to the voters they need to. When I talk about age before, like, the age wasn't actually much of a defining factor in previous elections right up until the 2017 election. So they have time to address this. The establishment has time to sort of readdress this balance, but whether they will or not, I don't know. It's very troubling. And I think, when you even talk about 15% pay rise for nurses before, like, even the argument for like a higher national living wage, like 15 quid, for example, just throwing out, a figure there, and like you've seen in the US with $15, but say £15 living wage, like, people would be like, oh my God, that's so much money. Like, what's happened to the businesses and stuff? But there is a way of doing that. It is possible. And as you say, it will fuel people will have more to spend. People that are on that sort of amount of money are more likely to spend in our economy. The people that are on, the billionaires, they're not contributing to society. They're not like putting loads of money into our economy. The idea of trickle down economics is absolute nonsense. They're hoarding their wealth. They're hoarding their assets. It's the people who are the workers who are going to be ultimately, helping build the economy, and like contributing to it. So yeah, like, I think these things need to be address. And I think Tories and the Labour Party are in real danger of losing, as you say, like a whole generation of voters who will see right through what they're doing and might even be put off politics for good, to be honest.
Now, you've got leadership elections coming up later in the year. It's fair to say that you are the leader at the moment, de facto, but you want to be elected to the post in order to remain so. And clearly there are other positions to fill as well. So what is the structure you have in mind at that point? And are you worried that you could be replaced by somebody who could do to your party what Starmer has been doing to Labour, or perhaps further down the line, take it down a road that it was never intended for? Are there plans to ensure that socialism cannot be replaced with neoliberalism within the Breakthrough Party?
Absolutely. Like, this is something I think maybe Ed might have asked me actually the other day, in terms of like, is there that fear? Like, of course, like when we've got these, we've got elections later this year, as you say. We've got national committee elections, later this year, which will be elected by our members and representative from across the country. And, ultimately they will be accountable to our members, right? Same with like the sort of the leadership positions, you said, like the leader, deputy leader, and whoever else, and they'll be accountable to our members. There is, of course, like there is always a fear that the party could be hijacked by a neo-liberal sect, I guess. But I think we are trying to put the processes in place to ensure that doesn't happen. Like, we have our principles, we have our values, and we want to make sure that they don't become diluted as time goes on. I can't see that happening. I'm hopeful it won't happen. I think in terms of myself as well, like I said this, I think, to Ed the other day, but I wouldn't, like, if someone did come in who could do a better job than me, like I would support them if our members supported them. And I'm just wanting this to be something beyond, because again, like this was like a few months ago, it was just me, right? It was just me that I had this idea, and I went, great, like let's really do this. And now it's a lot bigger than that, and it's going to only get bigger than that. And I want to be a part of it, but I don't have to be it. I think that's been the issue of a lot of parties in the past, where it's become very, very much driven by an ego, and that's something that definitely doesn't exist within our party. We've got such a fantastic group of volunteers who pretty much like make this party happen, and I'm very grateful for them. I don't have any concerns, I think, about it being hijacked or anything along those lines.
I was just thinking, wouldn't it be novel for a political party to have something like a constitution to be tied to, I suppose. We've seen how the establishment and the mainstream media rallied against Jeremy Corbyn when he was leader of the Labour Party. The threat he was seen to be to the status quo, the unparalleled attacks made upon him and what he stood for. They were merciless. This is what faces any truly socialist organisation. I know we talked a little bit about this before we started recording, but how do you feel about facing that? And have you thought about how you would challenge it?
Yeah, of course. Like, we've already seen it with Northern Independence Party, haven't we? Like, like the attacks have been quite relentless, and understandably so. The establishment are terrified of new democratic socialist parties coming in and disrupting the status quo, right? So yeah, like, am I scared that this could come to us as well as we keep growing? Like, yeah, of course. Like, it's quite scary to see what tricks the media play and what they're trying to do. But I think what we need to do unashamedly is call out the media's bullshit and not be afraid to do so. Like, that's what we need to really do as a party. Ultimately we are anti-establishment party, and we are a threat to the elite. So it's more than inevitable that these attacks will come. We've seen as well, like with Keir Starmer, like, his attempt to appease the right-wing press. It hasn't really worked out. So I don't really see any point in trying to play their game, really. And we've also seen as well, when we talk about our party, it's a youth-led party. They're not consuming this traditional media anymore. So we don't really need to be reliant on these newspapers and organisation, traditional media organisations to get the word out now. We're really supportive of independent media, and I think that's the way forward, in our opinion.
Cool. Well, I'm all for supporting independent alternative media. Would you actually boycott any establishment media, though? Are there any that you've already decided out and out, I'm not going near them?
Yeah, I think it's quite obvious, like the Daily Mail and the Sun, absolutely. And I think there will be more, if I'm perfectly honest with you. We need to be, we've seen what these organisations have done in the past in terms of, how they've treated minorities, how just some of the hate that they spew out is just absolutely disgusting. And we could never, as a true democratic socialist party, ever support that. So yeah, I'd say there two that we'd 100% boycott, but I think there will be others as well.
Now, I've often finished with this question, and I'm particularly intrigued as to what you'd say to him, quite honestly. But as you might be aware, Keir Starmer himself does tune into our programming from time to time, as do members of his staff. If you could say something to Keir Starmer directly, now's your chance. Have you got a message for the Labour leader?
Yeah, what would I say to him? Over the last 12 months, Starmer and Labour have led this counter-revolution against the left and completely abandoned those who voted Labour in 2017 and 2019. We've talked about young people, but also minority communities and the most vulnerable in our society. They won't ever forgive him, and they won't forgive Labour if they continue down this path of plastic patriotism. This country now more than ever before needs real transformative change. And if the Labour Party isn't going to give and deliver that to people, then parties like ours will. And we're not afraid to stand up for people and do that. And we will do that. And we're not only going to try and get the Tories out, we will get Labour out as well if they continue down this path.
Alex Mays of the Breakthrough Party, thank you so much for your time tonight. It's been a genuine pleasure to speak to you.
Thank you very much, Damo.
Take care.
Cheers. Bye-bye.